Karen Reed arriving for the first day of her murder trial in the death of her boyfriend, Boston police officer John O'Keefe.
Karen, do you think you're going to get a fair trial?
A crowd of her supporters gathering outside the courthouse as usual as prosecutors tell jurors that Reed is a murderer.
Defendant Karen Reed is guilty of murder in the second degree, striking the victim, Mr. O'Keefe, with her car, knocking him back onto the ground.
But the defense says Reed is a victim of a massive police frame-up.
Karen Reed was framed. Her car never struck John O'Keefe. She did not cause his death.
I'm laying out the top moments from day one of Karen Reed's murder trial and opening statements. Thanks for joining me for Crime Fix. I'm Angenette Levy. After more than 2 years, the trial of Karen Reed for the death of her boyfriend, John O'Keefe, is underway. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts calls Karen Reed a killer, while the defense says she's a victim of a police frame job. Second-degree murder is, of course, the most serious charge that Karen Reed faces. She also faces charges of vehicular manslaughter, driving under the influence, and leaving the scene. Assistant Commonwealth Attorney Adam Lally began his opening statement by telling the jury about who John O'Keefe was, to humanize him. He also told them about the fact that he was raising his niece and nephew as his own.
He was the son of John O'Keefe Jr. and Margaret, or Peggy O'Keefe. He was a brother to Paul O'Keefe and to his sister, Kristen Furbush. Kristen was married, and so John's brother-in-law was a man named Stephen Furbush, and they had 2 children who were very young in 2013. Now, in 2013, Kristen, unfortunately, tragically passed away, succumbing to cancer in November of 2013. Within months of that, Mr. O'Keefe's brother-in-law and Kristen's husband, Stephen, passed away as well. Now, initially, when John O'Keefe's sister passed away, sort of the initial plan for that situation was that John O'Keefe was going to move in with Stephen Furbush and the kids and assist as far as raising them. And then when Stephen passed away a few months after his wife, before those plans could be finalized, John O'Keefe then moved in with his niece and nephew and assumed the parental role and assumed legal guardianship with respect to both of those children.
This is a Law&Crime legal alert. Google Incognito tracked users' browsing data without their knowledge. Mass Tort Alliance, one of our legal sponsors, is helping users file for compensation because Google misled users about the privacy of their incognito browser. If you've used Google Incognito anytime since 2016, you can start your claim by answering less than 10 questions. Just log on to incognitoclaims.com/crimefix. Lally also described the relationship between Karen Reed and John O'Keefe. They had met years earlier.
Eventually, the defendant, Karen Reed, joins them at this establishment at McCarthy's, sometime just before 9 p.m. Now, John O'Keefe and Karen Reed had met sometime in 2004. They had dated briefly during that time and reconnected sometime around March of 2020, around the time of the COVID-19 sort of pandemic shutdown. They had started dating around that time period, or reconnected during that time period, and the defendant had stayed at the house in Canton several nights a week. She had helped out with the children. In the month or so leading up to Mr. O'Keefe's death, the relationship soured. You will see text messages between Mr. O'Keefe and Ms. Reed to that effect. You will hear testimony from the children, from John's niece and nephew, in regard to things they observed within that relationship.
On January 28, 2022, surveillance footage captured Reed and O'Keefe at a bar enjoying drinks with friends. Then Lally said they planned to go to the home of another Boston police officer, Brian Albert. That home was on Fairview Road. A number of people had planned to gather there to just hang out.
From their position, I anticipate the testimony that you're going to hear is that Heather Maxson from that pickup truck observes a male passenger and a female operator when the pickup truck operator flashes those lights that the vehicles are facing each other before they pull down Fairview. What you'll hear also, I anticipate, from all 3 of those individuals in the pickup and Julie Nagel, who comes out to the pickup to talk to the brother, is that no one ever exits that vehicle. There are no footprints around that vehicle. There's no damage that they observed to that vehicle at that time. Again, it's just started to snow. Things aren't sticking really too much at this point. Julie Nagel has a conversation with her brother, decides if she's going to stay at the house longer, so arrangements for a ride home, and the pickup truck leaves from that point. As they pass by, they observe a female operator matching what I submit as the description of the defendant. From all of those people within that house that evening, none of them at any point in time observed John O'Keefe come into the house. They see the vehicle out front, they see the vehicle pull away, and they just assume that they left and that no one was coming.
So Lally says no one in the house on Fairview Road ever saw John O'Keefe enter the house. O'Keefe was expected to arrive sometime after midnight. Then around 5 a.m., Lally said that Karen Reed started calling people.
We hear testimony from other individuals who were at the house that night, including Colin Albert, who is Julie and Christopher Albert's son. He's also the cousin of Brian Albert Jr., who was having people over for his birthday. He's leaving the house around the time that the initial people coming back from the waterfall, which includes the homeowners and Mr. Higgins, are sort of coming into the house. At that point, Colin Albert was leaving. He's getting picked up by a young lady named Allison McCabe, who is Jennifer and Matthew McCabe's daughter, who's also friends with Colin Albert and also cousins of Brian Albert Jr., who's within the home celebrating his birthday. As I mentioned, you'll hear testimony from Matthew McCabe and from Jennifer in regard to their observations that particular evening, both at the waterfall as well as at the residence on Fairview Road. And then you'll hear testimony in regard to a phone call. A phone call that Jennifer McCabe receives from John O'Keefe's niece at approximately 4:53 in the morning. She answers that phone call, speaks to the niece briefly, and the niece hands the phone over to the defendant. Now, you'll hear testimony from the niece as well that about 4:30 in the morning or so, the defendant came into her room in a frantic state, saying that Mr. O'Keefe had not come home the night before. So initially, when the defendant is talking to Ms. McCabe, she indicates to Ms. McCabe that the last time she saw Mr. O'Keefe was at the waterfall. Eventually, as Ms. McCabe is waking up, she reminds the defendant that she not only saw them leave the waterfall around the same time as herself, but also saw the vehicle, the defendant's vehicle, outside of the home on Fairview Road. Eventually, the defendant, while driving around, this will come in as far as other testimony and related testimony as it develops, but she's driving around in that morning. She's calling a bunch of number of different people, friends of Mr. O'Keefe. She's calling Mr. O'Keefe himself. She also calls Ms. Roberts. So Carrie Roberts receives a call about 5 a.m. from the defendant indicating that Mr. O'Keefe did not come home, indicating that he got hit by a plow or that he must be dead.
Lally then described what he claims Reed told firefighters who responded to Fairview Road after John O'Keefe was found mortally injured in the snow.
Several firefighters from the Canton Fire Department you'll hear from in regard to their observations of injuries, abrasions, and lacerations to the right arm of Mr. O'Keefe. You'll hear their testimony in regard to swelling of his eyes and other injuries that he observed. They observed redness from the cold that he had been lying out in for some time. You'll hear the testimony from these firefighters, Timothy Nuttall, Anthony Flamati, Matthew Kelly, Francis Walsh, Katie McLaughlin, and Greg Woodward. And at least from 3 of those firefighters, you'll hear testimony anticipates detailing statements that the defendant made to them when they had asked about the origination of some of those injuries. The defendant stated repeatedly, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him.
Lally's position is that Karen Reed and John O'Keefe's relationship was essentially over, that they got into a huge argument by Reed's own admission to others, and that she backed into him, throwing him into the snow and leaving him to die. One piece of evidence that will be hotly contested in this case is a Google search that includes a typo. It says, how long does it take to die in this cold?
While they're waiting there, at approximately 6:23, 6:24 a.m., during a conversation with the defendant asks Ms. McCabe to look up on her phone how long someone has to be out in the cold to die from hypothermia, something to that effect. And you'll hear some dispute as to when that search was made. And you'll hear testimony from 3 different forensic extraction experts, Mr. Nicholas Carino, Ms. Jessica Hyde, and Mr. Ian Whitfield. You'll hear about a lot of these things called extraction reports from cell phones. And the extraction reports are done with a program called Cell. Mr. Whiffen is someone who writes that software for Cell. I anticipate you'll hear from each of their testimonies that that Google search that was done on Ms. McCabe's phone was done at the same time frame that she indicates the defendant requested her to do it, and that at 6:23 and 6:24 morning. We'll hear testimony from Ms. Roberts, Ms. McCabe, the firefighters, and the responding Canton police officers about a repeated phraseology that the defendant stated while there, asking again and again with regard to Mr. O'Keefe, is he dead? He's dead.
That Google search has been fiercely debated over the last 2 years. The defense contends that Karen Reed had nothing to do with the search, claiming it happened hours before 6:23 a.m. at actually 2:27 a.m.
That was over 2 years ago. Karen didn't know then what you will learn during this trial. Karen didn't know that Brian Albert's sister-in-law, Jennifer McCabe, left the after-hours party at Brian Albert's house sometime after Karen pulled away. She didn't know that after Jennifer McCabe dropped off some people elsewhere, she returned to her own home. Karen didn't know that Jennifer McCabe climbed some stairs in her home and eventually made it into her bedroom with her cell phone. Karen didn't know that Jennifer McCabe settled in at 2:27 in the morning on January 29th, 2022, and typed a Google search that she would later delete. 2:27 in the morning was over 3 hours before John O'Keefe's body was found on Brian Albert's lawn. 2:27 was over 3 hours before anyone knew or suspected that John O'Keefe was missing or hurt or in trouble. And at 2:27 in the morning, you will learn that with no one watching her, thinking she was alone with her thoughts, not worrying that anyone would know what she was doing, Jennifer McCabe typed in the following Google search: how long to die in the cold? Now, she misspelled the first word, so the actual search was how long to die in the cold, but you'll get the point. You will ask yourself, why would somebody Google how long does it take for someone to die in the cold, unless that person knew someone who either was in that situation or would be in that situation.
The prosecution also maintains that Reed knew where O'Keefe was and led a group of people, including Jennifer McCabe, to O'Keefe's body, and then tried to act as if she was trying to save his life.
Ms. Roberts then gets ready. Ms. McCabe is getting ready as they're all sort of planning to go out and look for Mr. O'Keefe to see if they can locate him. They call numerous times, and you see that within the text messages and the phone extractions from a variety of people's different phones throughout the course of this trial as well. So eventually the defendant comes to Ms. McCabe's home, indicates at some point prior to that she has a cracked tailpipe. Ms. McCabe then gets in the driver's seat due to the defendant's frantic state. Ms. Roberts is there as well. Ms. Roberts follows Ms. McCabe driving the defendant's vehicle back to Mr. O'Keefe's residence in Meadows Ave, checks on the niece. The defendant then shows both Ms. Roberts and Ms. McCabe the damage to her right rear taillight, which is essentially missing a number of different pieces from that right rear taillight. They then proceed off to drive and see if they can locate Mr. O'Keefe. The defendant is insistent that they go to that residence on Fairview Road. Again, they're driving down there in the dark, in the snow, in the wind, in the blizzard. As they approach towards that residence, there is one person. So they're seated within the vehicle. This is Ms. Roberts' vehicle. She's driving. Mrs. McCabe is in the front passenger seat. The defendant is in the rear passenger seat. The defendant is the only one who sees Mr. O'Keefe. Yells and screams at Ms. Roberts to stop the vehicle. Ms. Roberts and Ms. McCabe, I anticipate, will testify that they did not see Mr. O'Keefe, not only as they were driving past him, but even after they got out of the vehicle until the defendant gets out of the back seat and makes a beeline essentially right over to where Mr. O'Keefe's body was found.
Lally then described forensic evidence that he says links Reed to O'Keefe's death.
Among the items that they locate is a sneaker. When Mr. O'Keefe is transported to the hospital, he's found to only have one sneaker on his feet. They find the other sneaker in that area of the body. They find various pieces of taillight. And as is wont to do, over the course of the following days, temperatures rise, rainstorm that comes in, and the snow melts. Over those successive days, there are additional pieces of taillights. From these different pieces, it's hard to also locates a cocktail glass that's located on the bumper or the rear area of that scene, and she locates a human hair on the back of that defendant's vehicle as well. Now, the cocktail glass on the bumper, you'll also see surveillance video from the waterfall, and Mr. O'Keefe is observed on that surveillance video essentially walking out of the waterfall with a cocktail glass in his right hand. Same right hand that has minor injuries to it, and the same right hand that's attached to his right arm that has the abrasions and lacerations that are observed by the paramedics, that are observed by the doctors at Good Samaritan, and are observed by the medical examiner as well. We'll hear testimony from another analyst, Christina Hanley, about the forensic consistency between a drinking glass that was in the defendant's bumper and the drinking glass pieces that were found on scene in 34th Fairview. You'll hear her testimony in regard to pieces of red and clear plastic that were microscopic in size that were found within Mr. O'Keefe's clothing. Consistent, in her opinion, I anticipate she'll testify, with the same pieces of plastic contained within the defendant's taillight. You'll hear from an Ashley Valley, who works for the lab as well, and how she fit the various pieces of broken taillight from the scene together and over that taillight housing, finding them to be consistent with each other as well. You'll hear testimony from Andre Porto, who does essentially DNA analyst for the lab. Samples that were DNA samples that were taken from the taillight, from the clothes of Mr. O'Keefe, the broken drinking glass that were consistent with Mr. O'Keefe. Those items were also sent, the taillight pieces, taillight DNA was also sent to the Canton lab, Bodie Technologies, located in North Virginia. And you'll hear from an analyst there, Mr. Nicholas Bradford, indicating that the DNA on the defendant's taillight, in his opinion, is consistent with that of Mr. O'Keefe and inconsistent with Trooper Proctor and Sergeant Buchanan, who were the two preliminary investigators and primary investigators when it came to this case. You'll also hear from this test chart from that Bodie Laboratories in regard to some mitochondrial DNA that she examined in regard to that hair that Ms. Hartnett found on the bumper of the car, in her opinion that it was consistent with that of Mr. O'Keefe as well.
Then, of course, it was the defense's turn. Attorney David Yannetti laid out the defense theory of the case.
Karen Reed was framed. Her car never struck John O'Keefe. She did not cause his death. And that means that somebody else did. You will learn that it was no accident that John O'Keefe was found dead on the front lawn of 34th Fairview Road in Canton on January 29th of 2022. You will learn that at that address lived a well-known and well-connected law enforcement family in Canton, the Alberts. Because the Alberts were involved, and because they had close connections to the investigators in this case, Karen Reed was framed for a murder she did not commit.
David Yannetti is a very skilled defense attorney. He used to be a prosecutor. He says Karen Reed was not part of the in crowd in Canton. And because Brian Albert's brother worked for the Canton PD, there was a conflict of interest. So Massachusetts State Police led the investigation. But Yannetti said that didn't really matter because the lead detective, Michael Proctor, was biased against Reed from the get-go.
Called Karen Reed names you would reserve only for your worst enemies. He told his friends that he hoped that she would kill herself. He told his friends that he had seized her cell phone. And you will learn that he knew he shouldn't have been accessing any content on her cell phone because he knew there would likely be attorney-client communications on between Karen and me at that time. He knew that he was supposed to wait for a search warrant or other permission from a judge in order to go through that phone. But you'll learn that he went through the phone anyway, without permission. And you'll know that he did because he told his high school buddies that he was searching her phone for nude photos of Karen Reed. And he was disappointed he hadn't found any yet. That is the professional and unbiased investigator who was chosen to lead the investigation into the death of John O'Keefe.
Yannetti pointed to things he said showed bias on Proctor's part and a desire to frame Reed.
You'll learn that right from the jump, Michael Proctor predetermined the outcome of this case. Never stepped foot inside the Albert home on January 29th, 2022. Never checked out whether there were any signs of struggle inside that home. He never called for crime scene technicians and other specialists to look for blood or other trace evidence within the home. He never asked Brian Albert for permission to go in the home and take a look around. Michael Proctor never applied for a search warrant to go in that home. Instead, he focused immediately and exclusively on Karen Reed, the outsider. You will learn that no one in the Proctor family has ever called the Reed family their second family.
The defense maintains that Reed actually backed into O'Keefe's car that morning as she left the home they shared to go look for him. You can see her backing up her Lexus SUV on home security footage, coming very close to O'Keefe's car, and then pulling out of the snowy driveway. It was, after all, a blizzard.
So she got back into her Lexus. She backed up out of the garage to leave the driveway. And when she did, the right rear taillight of her Lexus struck John's parked vehicle in the driveway, and her taillight cracked. That was the same taillight that the prosecution now claims was broken outside the Albert residence hours earlier at 12:30 a.m. But we have video evidence that the taillight was actually broken at 5 a.m., many hours after the prosecution needs that taillight to have been broken. There is, of course, no video of the taillight being broken at Brian Albert's house. You will eventually conclude that that's because the taillight was not broken there.
Yannetti also poured cold water on the idea that the relationship between O'Keefe and Reed was so damaged that it was essentially over and ended with a blowout fight in front of the house on Fairview Road.
Commonwealth will instead try to persuade you that Karen Reed supposedly had a motive to kill John O'Keefe because they were not getting along. You'll hear about their trip to Aruba over New Year's Eve and that Karen was upset that John had been flirting with another woman. And you will hear that Karen considered exploring her options after that trip, which led her to a get-together at one point with ATF federal agent Brian Higgins, although that never went anywhere. But you'll also hear that in January of 2022, after the Aruba trip, and not long before January 28th and 29th, John O'Keefe was making long-term plans with Karen, including a family trip with her and the kids, and also another trip with Karen and another couple for months into the future. And you'll see video of how John and Karen were interacting on the night in question. You'll see for yourself how they looked at each other from the video at the waterfall that night. Nobody who saw them that night saw anything wrong. There was nothing wrong. I mean, like any couples, occasionally they would bicker or disagree. But you will hear zero evidence of any domestic violence in that home whatsoever. John never raised a hand in anger toward Karen, and Karen never raised a hand in anger toward John. That simply wasn't who they are.
And what about John O'Keefe's injuries? Yannetti says the injuries were not caused by Karen Reed's car.
You will learn that there are other major problems with the Commonwealth's theory. You'll learn that when John O'Keefe was found, he did not look like he had been hit by a car. You'll learn that he looked to have been attacked and beaten up. You'll learn that John O'Keefe was a large 6'2" man who, if positioned behind a Lexus SUV, would have had his torso completely exposed to the rear of that vehicle, including to the taillight. You'll learn that no part of his torso was injured. There was no bruising, no ridges, no scratches, no punctures. You'll learn that his chest and hips and legs were pristine, despite the Commonwealth's contention that he was hit by a 6,000-pound vehicle. The evidence will show that what was not pristine was his right arm. You will take one look at that arm, and you will conclude that a car did not cause those injuries. The injuries to John O'Keefe's arm appear to be consistent with scratch marks and claw marks, marks that make it look as though an animal had attacked his arm. But you won't have to rely just on your common sense when you look at those photos. You'll hear from an expert forensic pathologist who is world-renowned, who has personally conducted thousands of autopsies. And he will testify that those marks are consistent with scratch and claw marks and bite marks from an animal, including a German Shepherd. You'll learn that on January 29th of 2022, Brian Albert's family dog, Chloe, was a German Shepherd. You'll learn that Brian Albert has admitted that this dog is not good around strangers. You'll learn that on January 29th of 2022, John O'Keefe would have been a stranger to that dog. And you'll learn that Chloe had been the beloved family dog for the Alberts for 7 years. The Albert family loved Chloe. But strangely, as we discuss this dog today, the Albert family doesn't have its beloved Chloe anymore.
Yannetti also addressed Reed's cracked taillight.
You will learn that there is no competent evidence that Karen Reed's taillight shattered at Brian Albert's property in the early morning hours of January 29th of 2022. To the contrary, you'll learn that when Karen left John at Brian Albert's house, she drove back to John's house on Meadows Ave across town in Canton. At John's home, where he lived with his 2 adopted children, Karen was drifting in and out of sleep, but she woke up for good in a panic sometime around 4 a.m. because John hadn't come home. And that was not like him at all. He had never done that before. Karen had a sinking feeling that something was wrong. Something was seriously wrong.
And the first witness for the Commonwealth actually happened to be John O'Keefe's brother.
Now, as far as your relationship with the defendant, Ms. Reed, prior to January 29th, 2022, how would you characterize it?
I thought we had a good relationship. I held her in very high regard. I thought she was a good influence on my niece and nephew. I appreciated all the help that she was providing to my brother with the kids. We'd go out together as, couples a couple times. She became very friendly with my wife, but I'd say overall we had a good relationship.
As far as those positive feelings that you had in relation to the defendant prior to January 29th, 2022, had you expressed those to either the defendant or any member of her family?
Yes. So Christmas Eve of 2021 was the first time I met her parents. My brother hosted Christmas Eve at his house. I met Mr. and Mrs. Reed. I offered to help Mrs. Reed, carry some things in from her car. And as we were walking to the car, I said, I just want to tell you, I think your daughter's great. I think very appreciative of what she's done for the kids and helping my brother.
I want to bring in criminal defense attorney Andrea Burkhart. She's been following the Karen Reed case pretty closely. What were your thoughts on opening statements, Andrea?
Well, I thought there was quite a distinct contrast between the approaches that we saw from the Commonwealth and the approach that we saw from the defense. My personal reaction to the Commonwealth's case was it simply didn't do a very good job, I thought, of laying out for the jury a real roadmap of what they should expect to see and what was going to be important in the case, like what specific details were going to matter when it came down to making their decision. I think the defense did a much better job of being able to present the theme of their case very clearly and explicitly. Karen Reed was framed, was the opening words of the defense opening. So that's the kind of thing that typically is going to stick with the jury. And when they're evaluating the evidence, they're going to be able to evaluate how well does it measure up to this expectation that's been set with that very simple sentence. Because we didn't get the same kind of refined expectation from the Commonwealth, I think they might find it harder to follow the Commonwealth's case.
That's it for this edition of Crime Fix. I'm Angenette Levy. Thanks so much for being with us. We'll see you back here next time.